Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a good time. So, welcome to the session on opportunities and challenges with real world insights. Real world insights and data is rapidly transforming healthcare and life sciences by providing them actionable evidence that goes beyond traditional trials. It allows organizations to better understand patient outcomes, optimize research, and drive innovation across the system. At the same time, leveraging RW insights comes with its own set of challenges, from ensuring data quality and integration across diverse sources to overcoming adoption hurdles in complex healthcare systems. So, in this session, we'll explore the opportunities and the practical challenges and discuss how organizations can use real world evidence insights effectively to generate impact. So I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Martin Willemink. He's co-founder and chief scientific officer at Segmed and junior deputy editor at European Radiology. Dr. Martin is a physician, biomedical engineer, and entrepreneur driving imaging research at Stanford through real-world data imaging. He previously led cardiovascular imaging research at Stanford Radiology and has published over 100 plus peer-reviewed papers, delivered multiple international lectures, and received awards. Sorry. With that, I'm delighted to hand it over to Dr. Martin to share your insights. Over to you, Dr. Martin.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, tonight I'm going to talk about real-world imaging data for healthcare innovation. And the focus will be on Segmed, which is the company that I co-founded. Let's see if it works. Yes. So real-world imaging data is in high demand. A lot of people want to have access to real-world imaging data, but it is really hard to access this data. And that is blocking healthcare innovation. So we know that innovation needs proprietary data. There are a lot of companies out there that know how to handle clinical data like EHR, claims, registries, but most of these companies do not know how to handle medical imaging data. And that is the gap that we are filling with Segmed. So our focus is really real-world imaging data. Okay, so we are a global leader providing diverse and high quality and multimodal data sets. And we do this for diseases where imaging is central. So diseases where the diagnosis is made with imaging and where follow-up is done with imaging. So really the core of the information that is needed is coming from imaging. So think about oncology, like solid tumors, lung cancer, breast cancer. Think about cardiology diseases like coronary heart disease, and neurology like MS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. With all of these therapeutic areas, medical imaging is very important. And those are the kind of diseases where we see there is a high demand for medical imaging data. So what do? We unlock imaging studies for research, which means that we are able to provide the imaging data. So we do this for different modalities, including radiology modalities like MRI, CT, mammography, X-rays, ultrasounds. We also do it for nuclear medicine, so PET and SPECT, and also hybrid like PET-CT, PET-MR. Also cardiology modalities like echocardiography and invasive angiography, and also other data types in the imaging space like pathology, dermatology, and ophthalmology. So what we do is we actually provide the pixel data, which means the CT scan or the MRI scan, plus the associated metadata, which is the information that comes in the DICOM file. So this is semi-structured information that, for example, says something about the reconstruction or the acquisition technology. And then we also provide the radiology reports. On top of that, we also provide clinical information, which we will talk later more about. So I said before that people want to have real-world imaging data, but the question is, why do they want that? What are typical use cases for real-world imaging data? So here I have 7 different topics in which imaging data is relevant, and I will show an example for each of those. So we will start with biomarker discovery, which is kind of the most well-known use case for real-world imaging data. And this is a study that actually came out of my lab when I was still at Stanford, where we did a lot of research on aortic dissection. And we knew that false lumen thrombosis was a predictor for late adverse events in patients with Stanford type B aortic dissection. So what we wanted to do here in this study was to automatically quantify the false lumen thrombosis on CT angiography exams of the aorta. So that means that you can actually get specific information about the aortic dissection that is only achievable by looking at the images, by evaluating the images. There's no way you can get this otherwise. And that's a typical example for a real-world imaging data biomarker. Second example in post-marketing surveillance and evidence. So the reduction in the spleen size is a predictor for radiation-induced leukopenia. Here you can see an early exam pre-treatment where there is a spleen that looks normal, and here you can see the spleen size actually over time decreased. So in a study published last year in the Journal of Nuclear Medicine, the authors evaluated, hey, what if we automatically evaluate this, the volume of the spleen, and see if that can be predictive in patients that are treated for neuroendocrine tumors. And they actually found that this imaging biomarker was more predictive compared to conventional lab parameters. And again, this is a parameter that you can only see on the images. There's no other way that you can evaluate what's the size of the spleen versus just using the images. So that's an important use case for imaging data as well. Okay, the third one, drug repurposing and repositioning. So we all know that metformin is a well-known treatment for type 2 diabetes. It's a first-line treatment. However, real-world imaging data studies have actually shown that metformin also has other effects. It actually has an effect on the abdominal aortic diameter growth, and also patients that have been treated for aneurysms, so that have had an aortic aneurysm repair, the risk of mortality is lower. And that is found because of the images, because researchers saw, hey, in patients that are using metformin, we see that the aorta is typically smaller compared to patients that are not using metformin. So that's a good example of how a drug can be repurposed and repositioned based on real-world imaging data. Okay, number 4, participant identification. So before you start with a randomized controlled trial or any study, you need to have the right inclusion and exclusion criteria. In this study, published in 2022 in Tomography, the authors describe a failed randomized controlled trial for patients with soft tissue sarcoma. And this trial focused on evaluation of ivofosfamide. So the trial failed. However, if the inclusion and exclusion criteria were, amongst others, based on the CT scan that was acquired before treatment, then this study actually could have succeeded because the CT images allowed for further narrowing the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And here you can see in this graph that if they would have used the right inclusion and exclusion criteria, including the CT image parameters, then they actually could have seen a difference between the two drugs that were evaluated, while the excluded patients did not show a difference there, and in all patients you can see there's no effect. So this means that imaging data can allow for further fine-tuning their inclusion and exclusion criteria and can improve participant identification. So this means that the real-world imaging data here actually shows retrospectively that this study could have been successful if the right information was used from the images. So again, you really need the images to be able to do this. The fifth point is clinical trial design and optimization, which I want to use the same use case for, because you can imagine if you are able to improve your inclusion-exclusion criteria, you can optimize your clinical trial design, and you go from a failed trial to a successful trial. Okay, the sixth point is external control arm. So especially in rare diseases, 30% of the clinical trials are prematurely discontinued, and that is usually because it's so hard to include the right number of patients. It's a very slow process to recruit these patients. But if you're using an external control arm, which means that you're looking back in history and you're using data, longitudinal imaging data, clinical data, instead of a prospective control or placebo group, then you can actually get the same information, but you don't need to prospectively include those patients. You can use retrospective or real-world data and real-world imaging data. So the external control arms actually can be very helpful, and imaging data can be essential in that as well. And then the last example is understanding the natural history of diseases. So this was a study published last year in Nature Communications where they looked at brain MRI scans in patients with focal temporal lobe epilepsy. And they found on the MRI scans there were actually subtypes of the disease that were not defined before, just based on the anatomy of the brain, where they could see, hey, these patients actually have a different clinical outcome. So these patients really are different, but they had no way to clinically differentiate them based on any biomarkers or something like that until they actually started looking at these brain MRI scans. So that's really valuable because these images show, hey, the structure of the brain looks a little different, and that means that these patients have a different subtype of the disease. So imaging again here is very important and helped with understanding the natural history of this disease. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about the use cases of why do people actually want real-world imaging data, let's talk a little bit about Segmed, the company, and what we can actually provide. So we co-founded in 2019. We came out of Stanford and have raised more than $20 million to date. We are, amongst others, a Y Combinator company, and we have a very strong leadership team that is very focused on medical imaging data. So how does it work? On one side, we have the healthcare providers, so these are the people that have the data. And on the other side, we have the researchers or the companies that need the data. We at Segmed have developed the technology to connect to the IT systems of these healthcare providers. And when I say IT systems, I mean the PACS and the RIS system where the imaging data lives. We de-identify the data. Then we standardize the data and make it possible to search and filter through this imaging data and build cohorts of imaging data needed for research purposes. So our clients can log in and they can build a cohort of data that they then can use for research purposes. And we can do all of this at a very large scale. It's very scalable. We actually have customers who are, for example, big tech companies that need very large amounts of data, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of exams, to be able to develop, for example, foundation models. And our technology makes it possible to do that at scale. And then we provide this data to the companies that can do research with them. We have direct live connections with the hospital PACS and RIS systems, which means that when a new exam comes in, we can provide that. So that means that we can refresh data sets. On top of that, we have institutional-wide consents. So not only the imaging data, but actually also other data like clinical data we can provide. A lot of companies have already used our platform. Here you can see some examples of our clients in the pharma space, in the med device space, and also big tech companies and healthcare technology companies that are all using our platform to get access to real-world imaging data. Okay, so what do we offer for these kind of companies? Well, you can divide it in two products. The first one is data, and the second one is tools. So let's double click on the data. We provide fit-for-purpose, regulatory-grade, multimodal data sets. So this means that we can provide a lot of different kinds of data at the core imaging, as I mentioned before. So we have access to a large network of healthcare providers. And within our network, we have access to more than 100 million radiology exams covering more than 20 million patients. We recently started onboarding on DataVent, which means that we actually now have almost 5 million patients on DataVent, and we can run overlaps evaluations. So if somebody has a data set that does not include imaging, we can run an overlap, and we then can provide for the overlapping patients the imaging data. Most of the network is in the United States, but we're also starting to expand internationally. Like I said before, we provide the radiology images and the reports, but on top of that, we can provide electronic health record-based information like demographics, history of patients, treatment information, and so on. Very deep data we can provide. We can also provide annotations by experts like radiologists or pathologists, and we can provide not only radiology images, like I mentioned before, also, for example, digital pathology images that are linked to the other data types. So multimodal data. Here you can see a sample data set from one of our sources, which is a top 5 nonprofit healthcare system in the United States. And these are 5 different cancers. These are all the number of patients that have are confirmed with these cancer types. You can see there's a good mix between academic and non-academic institutions. We have good diversity and so on. So the quality of the data is very good, and we have large amounts of data as well. Here you can see for just breast cancer patients for different institutions within our network. And if we, these are numbers of confirmed breast cancer patients. If we double click on one of them, which is a top community radiology chain on the US East Coast, you can see that we actually have good longitudinal information as well. So before the diagnosis of breast cancer was made, we have, for quite a few patients, we have images. We have images before and after the diagnosis with a good duration, so the longitudinality is very good of this data. In terms of the second product, the tools, so this is for companies that actually have data. Let's say there are clinical trials done, or there's real-world imaging data somewhere, but it's not really being used, and it's hard to centralize it all, and to search and filter through that data and to use it again. These tools are actually helpful for that. So we have Segmed Incognito, which is a de-identification tool that allows for de-identification of pixel-based information and also text-based information. So we can do a full de-identification of imaging data and text-based data. We also have Segmed Piper, which enables large-scale imaging data migration. So we can actually transfer the data to different places so that it can be used for research purposes. And then the third one is Segmed Openda, which is our cohort builder. So that can be used to search and filter through your own data and build data sets needed for research purposes. Okay, a few case studies that actually have been done within the Segmed platform. The first one is a predictive image biomarker study in non-small cell lung cancer. So this study actually was presented at ASCO this year. The link is here. I'm happy to provide any link to anybody that would like to see this specific use case, but it's about tumor angiogenesis. So it's critical to cancer progression and also to treatment resistance. There are conventional biomarkers like PD-L1 to predict long-term patient outcomes like survival, overall survival. However, it is not super reliable, and therefore this client wanted to see, hey, are there any radiology biomarkers that we can use to better predict these long-term outcomes in this patient population? So what they did is they wanted to evaluate the quantitative vessel tortuosity, the QVT, which quantifies abnormal vascular architecture on the CT scans before the treatment starts. And what they wanted was a complete patient journey with baseline and follow-up CT images, treatment details, and outcome information as well. So what we did at Segmed is we provided more than 200 patients with RECIST information, also molecular biomarkers, so that the difference can be seen between the molecular and the imaging markers. And here you can see some of the data elements that we provided. So there's a bunch of clinical information on top of the imaging data that we provided. The client did their study and they concluded that QVT indeed can be used as a non-invasive biomarker using the standard of care CT scan. They actually also found that the performance was better than the conventional biomarker PD-L1. So that, of course, is a nice example of how imaging data can be helpful in real-world evidence. The second case study is on getting AI insights for lymphoma and metastases on FDG PET scans. So the problem statement here is it is very time-consuming and difficult to do the manual interpretation for lesions on FDG PET, and also if you ask one radiologist or nuclear medicine doctor and you do the same and you ask somebody else, then you might get different results. So it's important to get a standard and automated way to evaluate these kind of scans. So this client asked for FDG PET scans, including Hodgkin and non-Hodgkin lymphoma and metastases from various primary cancers. What we provided was 850 FDG PET scans from different patients. We provide the reports, the DICOM files, and also some patient information and some information, for example, at the radio tracer details in those. In the end, this resulted in an FDA 510(k) clearance for this client based on the data that we were able to provide them. And then the third case study is an external control arm for patients with pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma. The problem statement here is for the external control arm, which we already discussed a little before. Traditional trials are costly and slow. So being able to have an external control arm would be helpful. So they needed a robust external control arm for their phase 2 randomized controlled trial with PDAC patients. And in order to do that, we helped them and we provided for 30 patients the CT images at least 2 time points. And we also provided additional clinical information. And in the end, this helped them with building the external control arm for this phase 2 clinical trial. So in the end, it was very helpful to this customer. Okay, so we've seen that real-world imaging data adds a lot of value to the real-world evidence, real-world data sector. It is not very well known yet, and not everybody knows how to handle the imaging data, but that's where we come in hand. So we can actually help with providing the imaging data. The 3 use cases that I showed within Segmed are the biomarker development, automated insights with AI, and external control arms. But as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there are many more different use cases that can be done and also that have been done on our platform. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions and to discuss more.
Well, thank you, Martin, for the presentation. Very cool. Some of the examples of kind of studies, kind of research, and using Segmed platform. This is not something we have been accustomed to seeing commonly. So one question I had for you, and this is something we have discussed in the past, right? As somebody who has been in the real world evidence or real world research area, me and a lot of other researchers have been used to data that does not have imaging data. At best, we might have some insights from the report from the radiologist. Now, coming with that kind of historical background, as I look at a research study, how do I shift my mindset, challenge myself to think about imaging in the context of a study? Have you experienced this challenge before? How have you typically, what would be your advice to address this?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's not, to be honest, not extremely straightforward. Like when you're getting structured data, like EHR data, you just get, like a CSV file or a table that has specific information. When you're looking at imaging data, you just get a bunch of unstructured pixels that contain information, but you actually need some expertise, like a radiologist, or you need some AI model that's like radiomics model that can look at the images and extract the information. So extracting information from images is not extremely straightforward. However, since there is so much information hidden in those images, you see that people are starting to build teams to work with that. And something that is on our pipeline as well, in our roadmap as well at Segmed, is not to just provide the data, but actually to also be able to provide insights and analytics based on the imaging data. So yeah, one thing is it's important to realize that you do need some expertise to be able to work with the imaging data, but it is worth it because you get so much information that maybe your competitor doesn't have at this moment, or that actually will add that value that otherwise you would not have.
Makes sense. Martin, if I were to conduct a real world study, and I think, like you said, the most common use case has been AI biomarker development and validation. But if I were to do it in context of a retrospective study for efficacy of a treatment, when I use real world imaging data, does it significantly change the way I design a study, the way I would write the protocol, the way I would go to ethics board, or is it pretty much the same?
Yeah, I don't think it would change it significantly, to be honest. Just consider it another data type. If you work with claims or EHR data, like there are specific inclusion-exclusion criteria that's very similar for the real-world imaging data. Just for example, we get a lot of requests, of course, for a combination of clinical and imaging data. And the inclusion-exclusion criteria are typically just intermingled, but there is some specific imaging requirements. For example, hey, we're talking about lung cancer, so we want to have CT scans of the chest. We're not interested in an MRI scan of the brain or something like that, right? So you have to put that in your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So that is important that you, but we can help with that as well, like to make sure that you have the right kinds of imaging exclusion criteria. But otherwise, yeah, just consider it another data type that that you can use as information for your specific study.
Got it. Got it. Coming specifically to Segmed, you mentioned different tools that Segmed is working on, Piper, Openda. As you look at the future for Segmed, any specific development plans on your roadmap? What are you looking to solve in the near run?
Yeah, no. So what I think is very important for us, historically, we're coming out of the AI space. So historically, we have a lot of med device, big tech, healthcare technology customers that want to develop AI models. So getting training data, validation data for AI models. We are now seeing, hey, there is actually a lot of demand for real-world imaging data in the real-world evidence space, like pharma, life science. However, the data needs are a little bit more complex. And these teams are not so used, as I mentioned before, to actually handling the imaging data. There are definitely teams that know how to do it, and that's we're already working with them. But one thing that we want to, like what's the future for us is being able to provide the analytics and the insights based on the images. So instead of going to Segmed and saying, hey, I want to have 1,000 MRI scans of the brain of patients with Alzheimer's, I would like to know what the effect of the white matter volume is, or what the effect of a specific drug is on the white matter volume in the brain of patients, or something like that, right? Like, but much more specific and actually getting that kind of information. So that's going to be our future, is being able to not provide just the data, but actually provide the insights and analytics as well.
Makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, and probably that will kind of partially answer the next question, which I thought. Like I started, right? It's not very conventional to think of using real-world image data for many real-world scientists, but definitely the world has moved. There is so much more that can be generated in terms of insights from the data. Besides Segmed, are there any larger concentrated efforts to bring this awareness in the research community? Are there other companies or universities doing the same?
Yeah. Well, so when we started in 2019. There were maybe one or two companies that were doing something like us, or like providing real-world imaging data, but it was very limited. As a founder of a company, I hated it that I saw, hey, there's more companies coming up that are doing the same thing. I was like, hey, come on, get your own idea, don't steal our idea. But our investors actually, and they were right, they said, well, listen, if you were the only company in this space, that's not a good sign. That means there's no market, that means there's nobody interested in this kind of things. And we see, hey, there's more and more companies coming into this space. We are still the leader, but there are more companies coming, so that means there is something to get. That means there's actually an interest. So yes, there are other companies that are starting to work in this space as well. Yeah, there is a trend towards multimodal data as well. So there's a lot of companies, as probably most people here know, that are able to provide real-world data and being able to add imaging to that. That's really the core of what we want to do. So we actually are also looking at working with some of these real-world data companies, and we can just, because we are the imaging guys, we really understand imaging, that we can help them with that. Because that, you have to have a specialty, you have to have a differentiator, of course, in this space. So that's what we are focusing on. But yeah, there is definitely a trend in the space towards multimodal. There's more interest in imaging, and I think that's going to be needed. And we actually are very actively working on, blog posts, white papers, like peer-reviewed papers, to show the world, hey, there are images here. You should use them because you can get a lot of information out of that. So a lot of education and market development needs to happen when it comes to imaging in the pharma life science world. And we are working on that, and there are other parties working on that as well.
And sounds like a great objective or mission to have, Martin. I hope, thank you so much for sharing insights, the cool work that you've been doing at Segmed with our audience. really hope the next year when we invite you again, it would be like this would be a much more widely accepted area, and probably we will talk about 30 or 40 case studies instead of 5 this year. Thank you so much, Martin, for taking the time.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great. And yeah, I would love to come back next year and tell you about all the progress that we've made.